you know, the term for that these days is everyday racism. But that kind of seems to minimise it, doesn't it? I mean, that kind of thing affects the people who are subjected to it. It seems worse to me than everyday racism. That kind of makes it seem like it's okay, and it's not.
Ali, our producer here, brought out, which I think, Fetty, is a really interesting point, and the big thing also to how to have these conversations. How do we call problematic things out without more division, without more anger, without people getting defensive? That's been a big thing with people online, for example, on Twitter and Facebook, not knowing how to talk with each other about this. How do you do it? Any advice?
I'm not sure. You know, I think it's important that people should take responsibility for that, you know, rather than always the oppressed that are always bringing it up and always talking about it, and it sounds like, oh, here they go again, sort of stuff. And I remember during the 1981 Springbok tour at the CTU, the Trade Union Centre, who was leading the Springbok tour. And I remember Māori at that time, Hone Harawira, and Hilda, they all stood up and they said, oh, so you can recognise racism thousands of miles away, but you can't recognise it here. And so that was a challenge, you know, that was a challenge. It was a good challenge. And, you know, to the CTU's credit, they took the challenge aboard and, you know, created workshops to understand the treaty better. So there's lots of things you can do, practical stuff.
But yeah, that education has got to be the key, isn't it? And there's been a lot of discussion over the past year about how poor our history curriculum is. And, you know, there does need to be a better understanding of the ongoing effects of colonisation. And if that was properly taught in schools, then people might have a better understanding of the issues that are still with us today.
Actually, Fetty, that's a very, very interesting point that you raised, because my dad was front and centre as a Methodist minister and part of the sort of the anti-Springbok tour, and that was one thing that he brought out, that racism was seen over there in South Africa, but it wasn't really linked to there wasn't that link made. So the comparison actually to what's happening now and back in the early 80s is very accurate, isn't it?
It is. And once again, you know, it took, you know, so-called radicals, they called us those days, to bring it out, you know, to bring it out from the darkness, if you like, from being invisible. You have to make it visible. And you have to challenge people all the time. You know, you can't be just blasé about, what did you just say? Hey, bro, don't say that. Well, you know, or challenge each other about, you know, saying things like that to others in the public, you know. A bit like, you know, if you see a woman getting, you know, a woman being victimised, you know, you've got to step in. You've got to move in. Same thing applies, you know, with racism. Don't let it go.
Back to the front. In terms of that calling out, do you agree with that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, sometimes, it must be exhausting having to constantly call out and do the educating. Actually, maybe it's up to those who are, you know, perpetuating the racism, or at least sitting next to the people who are perpetuating the racism, to do the calling out and to actually stop being defensive, to start listening and self-educating rather than relying on somebody else to do that emotional labour.
Lots to think about on that. Lots to think about. I really appreciate your time. Paula Penfold and Fetty Taito, thank you very much for being with us here on the panel, and a lot of responses. I'd love to try and read out some of your emails tomorrow on that, but thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks, Willis.
We are back 3:45 tomorrow. Checkpoint next.
This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. On tonight's program, the Prime Minister announces a Royal Commission of Inquiry into the Moss massacres. Were our security services looking in the wrong direction? Could this terror attack have been prevented? It will attempt to answer these questions and more. 3 victims whose paths crossed amid the shooting chaos are reunited at the Linwood Mosque, and the Privacy Commissioner takes Facebook to task for its lack of accountability over the live streaming of the attack. The Viking Sky luxury cruise ship finally docks in Norway after hundreds of passengers are helicoptered off the beleaguered boat. And speaking of ships, an investigation's been launched after emaciated cows were photographed on the Cook Strait ferry.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, ko Susana Leia Tawa tēnei. The Prime Minister has confirmed a royal commission will be held into the Christchurch shootings. Jacinda Ardern says the terms of reference have not yet been set, but they will reflect the seriousness of the attack and the need to get answers in a timely way. She says the inquiry will look at the events leading up to the terrorist attack and whether law enforcement and intelligence agencies could have done anything to prevent the massacre.
While New Zealanders and Muslim communities around the world are both grieving and showing compassion for one another, they are also quite rightly asking questions on how this terror attack was able to happen here.
Jacinda Ardern also announced a whistle-stop visit to China, where she will meet the President and Premier in Beijing. A much longer visit had originally been planned, but that's been pared back, right back in the wake of the Christchurch shootings. The Privacy Commissioner says Facebook hasn't accepted any accountability for its part in the Christchurch terror attacks. John Edwards sent a letter to Facebook executives last week regarding its role in the attack. He says there is growing frustration and anger over the social media company's lack of communication after the shootings were live streamed on the social network.
What we haven't seen, and what is a real disappointment to me, is any kind of acceptance of Facebook's role, any sort of critical self-reflection, any contrition or response.
John Edwards says 10 days after the mosque attacks, people could presumably still live stream a similar event. He says the only communication he received from Facebook last week was about passwords and not the Christchurch shootings. Almost $5 million has so far been raised by a fund focusing on the long-term needs of the people directly affected by the Christchurch terror attacks. The Christchurch Foundation was asked by the city's mayor, Leanne Dalzell, to set up a fund to support the families in the future. Its chief executive, Amy Carter, says they have so far received $4.8 million. She says the foundation will be led by the community on how the funds will be used.
We need to allow the time and space for the community to learn and express where they feel the greatest needs are. That will evolve over time, so we'll act as guardians of those funds, and then we'll meet with representatives from the Christchurch Muslim community and the families and decide in collaboration with them how those funds will be best used for the future.
Victim to Support, which is giving immediate help to the families, has raised $8.4 million through a Give a Little page. Emergency services are investigating after a letter containing an unknown white powder was sent to the building housing the spy agencies, the GCSB and the SIS in Wellington. A short statement says the agencies are working to ensure the safety of staff. The US President has tweeted, "No collusion, no obstruction, complete and total exoneration," in response to the long-awaited Mueller report. The report summary says there is no evidence that Donald Trump colluded with Russia during the presidential election. The CBC's Lindsay Duncombe reports.
The White House is celebrating the special counsel's conclusion that there was no coordination between Donald Trump's team and Russia in the 2016 campaign. Donald Trump spoke to reporters in Florida.
And it began illegally. And hopefully somebody's going to look at the other side. This was an illegal takedown.
On the question of obstruction of justice, the special counsel did not make a conclusion, leaving the decision to prosecute or not up to the Attorney General, who is a Trump appointee. For that reason, Democrats want to see the full report, including background information. This sets up a political fight between the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives and the White House.
Lindsay Duncombe reporting. A Northland baby has been diagnosed with the W strain of meningococcal disease. The 7-month-old is the first case in the region since an outbreak of the new strain was declared last spring. The District Health Board says 14,000 children in Northland have been vaccinated in the past 3 months, but that still leaves 8,000 who qualify for free shots but who have not been immunised. It says in some areas, such as Hokianga, only half of those eligible have been vaccinated, which is not enough to keep others safe. The DHB's Medical Officer of Health, Jose Ortega Benito, says the fact that a baby has now fallen ill shows meningococcal W is still circulating. He says if Northland doesn't increase the number of children vaccinated, it's at risk of another outbreak. Cantabrians suspected of having measles are being asked to stay away from large gatherings as the number of confirmed cases rises to 34. Canterbury District Health Board's Chief Medical Officer, Raymond Pink, says GPs are still under pressure to vaccinate the immediate priority group, which is those aged between 12 months and 13 years who have never been immunised against the disease. He says there is a risk that measles and also flu cases could spread as people gather to mourn the lives lost in the Christchurch terror attacks. Heavy rain is falling in the west of the South Island, with warnings of up to half a metre forecast along the main divide. Parts of State Highway 6 near Haast have already been flooded. Met Service is forecasting extremely heavy rainfall of between 500 and 700 millimetres for Westland, south of Ortida, through to tomorrow night. Similarly, heavy rain is also forecast for Fiordland and the headwaters of lakes and rivers in Otago, Southland and Canterbury. It's coming up to 6 minutes past 5. New Zealand golfer Lydia Ko has been unable to keep pace with the leaders in the final round of the latest event on the LPGA Tour. Ko has finished tied for 8th at 18 under par after ending the Founders Cup in Phoenix with a bogey-free 3-under round. The former world number one had 3 early birdies to move into a tie for 3rd, but could not make any more and finished 4 shots behind eventual winner Jin Young Ko of South Korea. The Central Pulse are looking to take top spot on the ANZ Netball Premiership ladder tonight when they host the Southern Steel in Wellington. 1 point behind the reigning champion Steel, a win for the Pulse would see them guaranteed to claim the competition lead. The Pulse are the only undefeated side so far this season, and coach Yvette McCausland-Jury says they want to retain that blemish-free record.
We're aware when we come into a game of assessing the opposition and looking at where we can attempt to outplay, but more importantly for us, we've been trying in these first few rounds to really get our own game quite settled, and it hasn't been perfect yet. So, maybe tonight it might be closer to perfect.
Yvette McCausland-Jury. NRL team North Queensland are facing up to 10 weeks without leading forward Jason Taumalolo. Scans have revealed that the Tongan star tore a ligament in his knee in the Cowboys round 2 loss to Brisbane at the weekend. That's the news.
Caution. If you're looking for reasons for why these events have occurred, then going to these kinds of...
and across the United States on this issue, waiting for what's going to happen.
As it happens, Morning Report, weekdays from 6. Then on 9 to noon, a new app promises to streamline the renting process. But what does it mean for tenants' privacy? And after 10, gendered brains, a sexist myth or a fact of life? Professor of Cognitive Neuroimaging Gina Rippon unpacks the stereotypes. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. A significant heavy rainfall event is expected for western parts of the South Island. To Northland through to Taranaki and Taupo, including Bay of Plenty, fine spells and isolated showers. Whanganui, Taihape and Manawatu, also Gisborne, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa, mostly fine weather. Horowhenua, Kapiti, Wellington, Marlborough and Nelson, mainly fine today, occasional showers tomorrow but only a few in Marlborough. For Bulla, mostly cloudy with a few showers, rain with heavy falls developing later tomorrow. Westland and Fiordland, heavy rain, downpours about the ranges and possible thunderstorms. Christchurch and Canterbury Plains, high cloud, scattered rain developing tomorrow. Canterbury High Country, Otago and Southland, occasional rain becoming persistent tomorrow with heavy falls near the main divide. Severe gale nor'westerlies developing for the High Country tomorrow morning. And at the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. It's 9 minutes past 5. You're with RNZ National.
Thanks, Susanna. And this is Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. A Royal Commission will investigate what could have or should have been done by government authorities to prevent this month's mass shooting in Christchurch. The Prime Minister has already revealed changes to gun laws that will come before Parliament next week. Now Cabinet has signed off on the high-level inquiry. Plans are also underway for a National Memorial Day to be held in Christchurch this Friday.
Last week, on the 18th of March, Cabinet agreed to establish an inquiry into the Christchurch Mosque's terror attack. Today, Cabinet agreed the inquiry will be a Royal Commission. While New Zealanders and Muslim communities around the world are both grieving and showing compassion for one another. They are also quite rightly asking questions on how this terror attack was able to happen here.
And our political editor, Jane Patterson, joins us now. Kia ora, Jane. What do we know? What details do we have about the scope of this inquiry?
Lisa, not a huge amount of detail other than a Royal Commission will be held, and really that is a significant part of the inquiry because it's the highest level of inquiry that can be held in New Zealand, and the defining feature of it is that it is completely independent from the government. The inquiry reports to the Governor-General, so the government, once the terms of reference are set, can really have no influence at all on the findings or anything or the way it is conducted. And a Royal Commission can also look into any matters that come up in the course of its inquiries to be able to contribute to its findings. And it also has the powers of compulsion in relation to witnesses, obtaining documentation and awarding costs. And as we've heard Jacinda Ardern talk about before, it's really going to focus in on the events leading up to the attacks in terms of the law enforcement and intelligence agencies, including the SIS, GCSB and the police. But it will not be looking to the police response or the first responders on the day. Now, she's just told reporters that the terms of reference for the inquiry and the person who will head it will be confirmed in the next fortnight.
And although those terms of reference are still to come, she gave some indication of, well, the scope and scrutiny that they can expect to be under, didn't she, Jane?
That's right. It's basically all bets are off in terms of those questions, but really coming back to what could have been done and what should have been done by agencies, whether there were red flags that were not picked up, whether there was too much of a focus on Muslim extremists as opposed to white supremacists. And also the Prime Minister has asked the Royal Commission to look at what could be done to prevent such an attack happening in New Zealand in the future.
Interestingly enough, she chose today to announce the fact, well, she's running out of time, that she's going to China this weekend.
So this has been in the works for a couple of weeks, and a much bigger and longer visit had been planned, and that would have been over about the course of a week. It would have taken in 3 cities, and there would have been a big trade delegation or a business delegation going over with the Prime Minister, but that has been pared right back. There's been a lot of activity behind the scenes to see whether it should be cancelled altogether or whether the trip should still go ahead, which of course it is. So it's really going to be 24 hours on the ground in Beijing next Monday, when Ms Ardern will meet with President Xi and the Chinese Premier. Now, of course, this is an incredibly important trip to Ms Ardern, and this would have really factored into the decision to still go ahead with it. We've had tensions over Huawei, we've had the postponement of the tourism event that's now back on, but that had all created a lot of speculation about the tensions or any strains within the relationship. And another factor had been that there hadn't been a trip planned between herself and the President, so she's going ahead with it, but it's going to be a much briefer trip. Ms Ardern saying it just didn't feel appropriate for her to be away for so long in the wake of these attacks, and she said the Chinese authorities have been very accommodating in their response.
So while she's planning this trip away, Winston Peters has arrived back from his trip to Indonesia and Turkey. What did he have to say about how successful he thought that was in his discussion with President Erdogan?
Well, another situation that blew up was President Erdogan last week showing blurred out images of the attack, the video that the attacker had shot, and that was all part of election rally, and also very inflammatory comments about anyone coming to Turkey with any bad motives in mind would be sent home in caskets. And of course that became very alarming to New Zealand, who felt that it was directed at New Zealanders, and also with Gallipoli commemorations coming up soon. So Mr Peters had been on a scheduled trip to Indonesia, and then he tacked a trip to Turkey onto that, and included in that was a meeting with dozens of Muslim countries. Now, he said that the message was delivered very clearly to the Turkish ambassador and to the President that the remarks and any anti-New Zealand sentiment were completely unacceptable, and he said that has been accepted and acknowledged by the Turkish authorities. Another report coming out over the weekend that Mr Peters had been napping during that meeting that was raised at Post-Cabinet today. He said that he was in a state of deep contemplation. He was paying attention all the way through and had comprehensive notes from that meeting.
Thanks, Jane. That's Jane Patterson, our political editor, joining us from the gallery there. Could the long-awaited Mueller report actually mark the best day of Donald Trump's presidency? US Attorney General William Barr has released a 4-page summary of the investigation into whether any of President Trump's people colluded with Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election, and also whether President Trump attempted to obstruct justice. 19 lawyers and 40 FBI agents, intelligence officers and forensic accountants worked on the 2-year investigation. Its findings, according to the summary, there's no evidence anyone from the Trump campaign colluded, but as for obstruction, the report couldn't decide either way. I asked the BBC's John Sopel if these 4 pages exonerate President Trump.
He thinks they do. He thinks that this is as clean a bill of health as you can get. And you know what? He's not far wrong. The Mueller inquiry broke down into 2 pieces, if you like. The first was there collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians in the lead up to the 2016 presidential election? On that, there is no ambiguity as far as I can see. In the summary that's been provided by the Attorney General, based on what the Mueller report says, it's an absolute clean bill of health. There was no conspiracy, there was no collusion, there was no kind of systematic cooperation between the Russians and the Trump campaign. So, tick. That bit, there was no collusion. Donald Trump always insisted there was no collusion. He's got a clean bill of health there. Let's go on to the second bit.
Yeah, obstruction. Obstruction of justice.
Yeah, exactly. The conclusion of the Attorney General is that there is not sufficient evidence to establish that the President committed an obstruction of justice offence. However, in this 4-page summary prepared by the Attorney General, there is an important line which is taken from the Mueller report, and the special counsel states that, and I quote, "While this report does not conclude that the President committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him." Now, if you're a Democrat in Washington, D.C., you're going to want to pick at that. You're going to say, well, what does that actually mean? What is the evidence that Mueller bases that judgment on? Why wasn't there a crime? Why doesn't he exonerate him? And so you're going to see repeated demands now for papers and people to come before the Judiciary Committee of the House, to come before the Intelligence Committee and explain all of that. And I think that's where you're going to see where the focus of activity is going to be among Democrats. I would just say this. I think there is a risk that the Democrats can overplay their hand here. The headlines tonight are, Donald Trump gets clean bill of health. The White House is saying he's got a clean bill of health. Donald Trump is saying, I've been totally exonerated. I think an awful lot of people will move on. I think the risk for the Democrats is that they look like they are trying to mount a coup against the president and not focusing on the issues that ordinary American people think about: health, education, and all the rest of it.
But as you point out, the door is still slightly ajar, and people will also be asking the question, won't they, about the Attorney General, because the Attorney General's making the final call on this. The Mueller report doesn't say either way. He leaves the legal fact to the Attorney General over the obstruction of justice issue. What is the relationship between President Trump and William Barr?
William Barr is a relatively new appointee as Attorney General. He is someone who expressed some reservations about the Mueller investigation. He was also a close friend of Robert Mueller, and the two have worked closely together. He served in the George H.W. Bush's administration as Attorney General. He is not seen as a kind of a Trump pushover. William Barr has got nothing to prove. I mean, he's long in the tooth. This is going to be his last job. He was brought back from, being in the private sector to come and do this job. He doesn't have to be a cheerleader for Donald Trump. And so I think that establishment Republicans found him a slightly reassuring figure. You also asked about, aren't people going to demand X, Y, and Z? I think my experience of politics over covering it for 30 plus years is that people have very limited attention spans. People kind of, look, if they published the full Mueller report with all the appendices, I'm sure there are a few people who would read every single word and say, look, there is this question here on page 74, paragraph 3, that I need answers to, that the American people need answers to. But I think that, broadly speaking, the Mueller investigation has been going on for 22 months. People have, Democrats particularly have put a lot of faith in Robert Mueller. If the conclusion is as William Barr states it to be, then Donald Trump is in a pretty strong position, and Democrats are going to have to reconcile themselves. But if they want to turf Donald Trump out of the White House, they're going to have to do it via the ballot box in November 2020. Nothing much else is going to happen before that, on the basis of what we've seen tonight from the Mueller summary that has been given out by the Attorney General.
John, what do you think the chances are of a full document dump here?
I think slim. Two aspects to this. If someone isn't going to be charged, but the report contains criticism of their behaviour, is it fair to that person that they are subject to criticism if there has been no legal wrongdoing? And that is something that the Justice Department is wrestling with, because they think, broadly speaking, if someone is indicted, then of course they face the full force of the law. But if they could have been more candid or whatever, but no action is being taken against that individual, is it fair that their name should be put into the public sector? Look, there'll be people who will be surprised, astonished. People see this through the prism of their own politics. And if you love Donald Trump, you're going to say it was always a hoax, it was always a witch hunt, how disgraceful that this ever took place, and how disgraceful of people like me in the media to report what was going on. And if you hate Donald Trump, you're going to say, this is ridiculous, how can this possibly be? He's guilty as charged, I don't believe it. That is where we are in politics, not just in the US, but in a lot of places around the world. But you know what? Everyone put faith in the Mueller investigation. It has carried on its work for nearly 2 years now. And I think at the end of it, Donald Trump has got pretty much a clean bill of health. And, it's interesting. He arrived back at the White House a very short time ago. He stood before the cameras. He waited until there was silence and no one was shouting questions. And he said, America is the greatest place on earth. He walked into the White House without taking a single question. And I thought, you know what? That is what relief sounds like. It's the old saying that goes back hundreds of years that, if you're going to take a shot at the king, you better not miss. And what's happened in Washington is that a lot of people who opposed Donald Trump had hoped, invested huge hope, that this might be the end of the Trump presidency. It's nothing like that.
John, it's a pleasure to talk to you as always. Thank you.
And Lisa, I'm sorry, I just wanted to say and express kind of my complete and total condolences for what has happened in New Zealand, but also watching from 10,000 miles away, total respect to the New Zealand people and the way they've conducted themselves over this hideous episode in Christchurch. I mean, you've shown the world how to behave.
And that was the BBC's John Sopel. And since the terror attack 10 days ago, a country and community has come together. But victims and their friends are still piecing together their accounts of what happened that Friday. Taufasel Alam was inside the mosque while his friend Mohammed Zubair was running late for prayers, driving down Linwood Avenue and being shot at by the gunman. They both have since realised their connection with Abdul Aziz Wahab Sadar, the man described as a hero for chasing the gunman with an EFTPOS machine. Alex Perrottet caught up with the three of them today at the Linwood Mosque.
This is the closest Taufasel Alam has come to the Linwood Mosque since the attack. Last week he told us he would never return. Today he has made it to the front gate. He hopes time will heal and he can get himself to go back in. But right now his scars are very fresh.
I'm a different person now. I can't wake up early in the morning the way I used to wake up. I just woke up with the shock today when I got early. I got a phone call. I woke up like a shock, so which is painful. And still now I can't eat properly, can't sleep properly.
As he was praying the first prayers, his friend Mohammed Zubair Rahman was driving along Linwood Avenue when an angry driver blasted his horn. Zubair turned and saw a gun emerging from the window.
I saw like the barrel, so on that time I was like a little bit like the shock in my body and just pressed the hard brake. So when I pressed the hard brake, just the bullet, he already like shot me, targeted me and shot me. So the bullet just crossed me. And then there was a signal light in front of me as well.
So just to stop you there, you're saying the bullet went probably in front of your car?
Yeah, it's just in front of my car. I heard the sound of the bullet.
When he arrived at the mosque, the gunman's car was blocking the driveway, so he parked behind, not knowing what was going on inside.
The driveway, when I get into it, and I saw like the 3 dead body in front of me, and one lady was like just stared at me, and she was like raised his hand, and she was like asking for help. And on that time I was like totally blank on my mind, and I was like stand for 1 minute, and then I thought like what's happening, because I already shocked, because that guy like already shot me, and I already shocked on my mind. And then when I saw the 3 dead body in front of my eyes, I just like totally like shocked, and I was like stand for 1 minute, and I was thinking what I need to do. I need to go and get help the lady, or should I run?
He decided to run to his car to avoid certain death. Inside, Tofazil was lying flat on the ground where many had been shot dead or were injured. He was holding a 10-year-old boy down on the ground to prevent him from running outside and getting shot. He didn't know who the boy was.
I had no idea who was the boy. Then last Friday, I met with him in the Hagley Park. I came to know that Aziz was the person who saved lots of life, you know, because he was the person who was chasing the terror.
So his door was open, he just managed to get the other gun and he started shooting at me direct, but because the way he parked his car and the rest of the car was parked, I just managed to jump between the cars and duck down and run. He was keep shooting at me.
Abdul Aziz Wahabadza had done an incredible deed. Armed only with an FPOS machine, he had ran out shouting, seeking out the attacker.
Then I heard my 2 boys, he was yelling, please, please, Daddy, come inside. I said, you guys go inside, I will be all right. When I ran back to the car park and I saw one body there and a shotgun next to it, I just picked the shotgun, pulled the trigger, there was no bullet in it. Because I wanted to put more focus on me, I didn't want him to go inside the mosque, because we had between 80 to 100 people praying there, and I was keep yelling, swearing at him as I'm here, come here, come here. Then I heard a lot of gunfire was coming inside the mosque, and that time I knew he was already in the mosque, and I just ran from the back, and I was keep still swearing, yelling, shouting at him, and then I saw him suddenly, he dropped his gun, and he just ran to his car. And I chased him to his car, then he sat on the driver's seat. We had a bit of distance. I didn't want him to get away. That shotgun I had in my hand, I just threw like an arrow on his window, smashed his side window.
By now, Mohammed Zubair had moved his car and was here on the other side of the street when he turned and saw Aziz chasing the gunman down that driveway. That emboldened him to go and help. But by the time he crossed the road, the gunman had fled and his worst fears were realised. The lady who had asked for help was dead. He shared detail of the scene too gruesome to recount. And now, Mohammed Zubair is struggling to sleep. He is haunted by the face of the terrorist.
To be honest, I couldn't sleep. So, because I saw the terror in front of me, and I can recognize his face as well, because when I saw him the first time in the road, I saw him, he was like wearing the helmets and all the things. He was wearing gloves, he was wearing the military dresses. I thought like, why is like wearing this type of dresses? Like, and his eyes was like very sharp. If you looked his eyes like eyes to eyes, you will be scared.
Abdulaziz keeps referring to him only as coward, nothing else. He says he doesn't deserve even to be called a man.
If I call him gunman, I'll give him the title of man, which is not, he doesn't not deserve the man title. He killing innocent people for himself. He was wearing bulletproof and he ran like a coward, and I could see the fear on his eyes. And that's why I call him a coward, because he wasn't a man, you know. We can't call him a gunman. Man is a big title to give to somebody, you know.
And Tofazal, who is day by day coming to terms with what happened, says he realised early on that he needed to face his fears and talk about what happened. He's encouraging others to talk.
I thought that if I isolated myself, it will run after me. So that's why I thought, okay, let's express it. let's talk to the people, let them know what's happened. Yeah, that's why I'm happy to talk.
The three of them are talking today, and they are praying and thanking each other for their heroic actions. But this is a long process, and they've only just begun. Mohammed knows that while there is healing and hope, there are still dark days ahead.
Mentally, like, I'm not stable right now because in the night, like, I all the time, before I never turn on the light because I couldn't sleep to turn on the light. But nowadays, every night I turn on the light and I have to sleep on the light because I can't see the dark. I can't see the dark because if I see the dark, I see his face.
And that report there from Alex Perrottet, you might be interested to know that all three of those amazing men have been offered counselling or are currently speaking to a counsellor. And that story will be up on our website if you'd like to look at the pictures. On Checkpoint on RNZ National, more than $15 million has so far been donated to 3 large funds to support the families affected by the Christchurch terror attacks. But just how much of it have they received? And a trip from hell, a luxury cruise ship arrives in port after narrowly escaping disaster during a severe storm in the Norwegian Sea. As always, we'd love to hear from you, so do text us 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. But now it's time for the headlines with Susanna.
The Prime Minister says the terms of reference and who will lead the Royal Commission into the Christchurch terror attacks will be confirmed within a fortnight. She says the Royal Commission will look at what law enforcement and intelligence agencies could have done to stop the massacre, as well as how to prevent any such attack in the future. Jacinda Ardern also announced she will make a brief visit to China this weekend, where she will meet with the President and Premier in Beijing. The Privacy Commissioner is criticising Facebook for not accepting accountability for its part in the Christchurch terror attacks. John Edwards has had no response after writing to Facebook executives last week. He says anger and frustration is growing over the company's lack of communication after the shootings, which were live streamed on its network. And he says it's now 10 days later, but people could presumably still live stream another terror attack. Cantabrians suspected of having measles are being asked to stay away from large gatherings as the number of confirmed cases rises to 34. Canterbury District Health Board Medical Officer Raymond Pink says there is a risk that measles and also flu cases could spread as people gather to mourn the lives lost in the Christchurch terror attacks. The police have called in a specialist to test an unknown white powder which was sent to the building which houses the GCSB and the SIS spy agencies in Wellington. Part of the building was cordoned off after 3 o'clock. The police and fire and emergency are at the scene and say they're working to ensure the safety of staff. A 7-month-old baby in Northland has been diagnosed with the W strain of meningococcal disease, the first case since an outbreak of the new strain in the region last spring. The Northland District Health Board says it has vaccinated 14,000 children in the past 3 months, but another 8,000 who are eligible have not had their free shots. The DHB's Medical Officer of Health, Jose Ortega Benito, says if they don't boost the number of children vaccinated, Northland risks another outbreak. Those are our headlines. We'll have an update of the news and weather at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. And Nona Peltier has joined me in the studio to talk business. Nona, Westpac Group, so $250 million. A lot of zeros in that. They put that aside as part of the compensation payouts for Australian customers.
That's right.
After the inquiry. So what's the latest?
Well, so they've put aside this 260 million Australian dollars for this first half that ended in March. So that's what they're saying is going to hit their underlying earnings. That's their cash earnings. Now, that's in addition to 118 million set aside in 2017 and 281 million set aside last year as well. So that I make that at 659 million. But it's not going to be enough. That's just another number they're throwing out there. In addition, they still haven't quantified how much they're going to have to pay out for the fees, that overcharging that their self-employed representatives, these are people that don't work for them but represent them, have also overcharged customers. In the 10 years ending in 2018, that was about $1 billion in fees. Now, how much of those fees were overcharged, we don't know, but there will be interest on whatever the overcharging was. And so, yeah, it's a major hit to that company. And you can expect that that's like we haven't heard the end there, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's a rolling snowball that just keeps getting bigger.
Well, misconduct's misconduct. You've got to pay eventually. Somebody eventually will be, catch you. And that's what we've seen with the Royal Commission there. And, the fallout will continue for sure.
Changes to the way the government contracts for goods and services are underway. So what can we expect? What's in the works?
Okay, so contracts sound kind of boring, but really they're important.
You said it.
They're important because when, for example, when Fletcher Building went out of the building and interiors business, they talked about the problems they had with their contracts. And we've seen other contractors, construction firms complaining about the onerous contracts that they have signed with government now. So this is a way of reviewing the way that the government contracts for goods and services. They're going to be looking at more than just value for money. So it's going to be more about having a contract that really, screws down the amount of money that the government's going to have to pay. Now they're going to be looking at other things. For example, a company that provides training and skills, opportunities for Maori Pacific Island groups, looking at things like how they can help the government advance towards its goals for sustainable development and environmental goals.
So money's not just going to be the bottom line. What can we achieve with this?
Yeah, exactly. And also there's going to be standardized contracts for public-private partnerships, which has been a kind of a grey area. Consumers don't necessarily like it. There's been a lot of criticism about the way that those contracts can or could be potentially negotiated. So it's going to be really interesting to see where that lands. We haven't seen those drafts yet, but we're going to see that from that infrastructure council, or that arm of government that's being established to look at infrastructure. And one of the things that's going to be important there is standardized contracts. That's something the industry has been asking for, and we're going to see that. Now, the submissions on those submissions on how those contracts are going to roll out have closed, and the cabinet can expect to see some recommendations from the Ministry of Business implement MBIE, whatever. Yep. You know who I'm talking about.
MBIE.
That's it, MBIE. They're going to be giving cabinet some draft suggestions there on how those contracts should be rolled out in May for them to consider. So there. That's what we had today.
What about on the markets, Nona?
Interesting day in the markets. Investors have dumped shares because they don't like the signs out of the U.S. economy. Some negative information there. And, so the market has had a bit of a tumble. And, U.S. stocks turned negative late on Friday, and we saw that roll right through here into Asia. Now, the New Zealand market, though, it didn't do as badly as some of the others. We're down 0.33% at the close, 32 points to 9,519. Now, when we closed just after 5, the ASX was down 1.15%, so that's substantially more. And certainly through Asia, we are seeing big drops there too. Our dollar, however, is holding pretty steady. We've seen this all along, 68.8 US cents, 97.1 Australian, and 52.1 pence, which is about where we were on Friday.
Yeah, hovering around the same numbers.
Exactly.
Thanks, Nona. Nona Pelsier with your business there. An investigation is underway into the treatment of cattle transported across Cook Strait yesterday after photos have emerged of cows appearing emaciated in the full sun with their ribs protruding. The Ministry for Primary Industries has confirmed to Checkpoint it is investigating and won't comment any further. It's understood the cattle were destined for an abattoir, but Ben, who was on board the ferry between Picton and Wellington yesterday, says they were in no condition to travel and it was an incredibly upsetting sight.
There was a bunch of cattle trucks. There was one with the shade cloths open, so they have these shade cloths that sit over top to shield the animals from the sun, I guess. I don't actually know, but that's what it looked like. And the one that had the shade cloths open, you could see pretty bony cows in there. And I could just make out through a lot of the other shade cloths as well that there was a good number of cows in fairly similar conditions, but I just couldn't get a good picture of them.
When you say bony cows, Ben, can you tell us a bit more about what you mean by that?
I grew up on a dairy farm, and it was a pretty small farm with not too much, it wasn't a big industrial system like most of the farms are these days. So I know what a fairly healthy cow looks like, and I know when they're looking really hungry and just sort of emaciated, I guess. And these cows looked fairly emaciated, like had bones sticking out, and you could see every individual rib, and just sort of bones everywhere, really. It was just like bones with skin on it.
And so how many of the cattle appeared to be in that condition?
Well, on that truck alone, I think there was, it looked like 12 of them on the top story and a multi-story truck, so I'm guessing there would have been, I don't know, 24 on that truck, maybe, possibly more.
And what did you think of the condition they were in?
Yeah, I know a little bit about how the dairy industry works, and I'm not naive enough to think that never happens. Like, I understand that that's how it goes, but it's really unfortunate and upsetting that is how the system works. It's really unfortunate that cows can get to the stage where they're that unhealthy. Like, it's the cow equivalent of that, the little child in the famine with his belly sticking out and just bones everywhere. And yeah, it's just upsetting that humans treat cows like commodities, and as soon as they stop making money, they don't get looked after, and they get sent to the works. It's just this, like, I don't know, it's just depressing, you know.
Where do you think they were headed, or do you know where they were headed?
I found out, I had no idea where they were headed until just recently. I found out they were bound for the abattoir, so they're on the way to get killed. But yeah, it's just a shame it's good that they're kind of getting put out of their misery, to be honest. But it's a real shame that they were even allowed to get to that condition to start with.
Yeah, because some people might think that obviously they were headed to the abattoir. Maybe this was a farmer doing the right thing and culling a herd that they didn't have the feed stock for. But do you think that they had left it too late to be doing this?
If a farmer has to cull off a bunch of cows because they don't have enough feed, then they're doing something wrong with their farming. And I think that sort of thing will happen a lot if you've got major industrial farming things, which is what we've got all over New Zealand now. These farmers pushing their soil and their grass to the limits of what it can handle. Sorry, go for the extra wind. To the limits of what it can handle. And therefore, when you get a bad season, there is nowhere near enough food to feed all your cattle. Farmers need to plan for bad seasons, which are going to happen more and more often as things change around the world.
What would you like to see happen, Ben?
I think on an overall scale, I'd like to see a lot less industrial farming in New Zealand. It's just destroying so much, and it's putting cows into horrible situations and destroying our waterways and adding to climate emissions and all these kinds of things. And I think reducing the herd numbers and managing farms properly can fix a whole lot of that kind of stuff.
And that was Ben. He was on a ferry between Picton and Wellington yesterday and took photos of those cows, which he says were incredibly emaciated. MPI is investigating. If you would like to see what Ben is talking about, that story will go up on our webpage and Facebook page, so you can check it out. They are disturbing pictures. A luxury cruise ship has arrived in port after narrowly escaping disaster when its engines failed during a severe storm in the Norwegian Sea. The Viking Sky was with almost 1,400 passengers and crew on board, sent out a mayday signal yesterday as it drifted into rough waters and nearly ran aground within 100 metres of land. Rescue services airlifted 479 mainly elderly people by helicopter. Two of them were Americans Ruth and David McIntyre. They spoke to the Norwegian broadcaster NRK when they were back on dry land.
We're just realizing today how close we came to an amazing catastrophe, and we think a gold medal should be given to the captain of that ship. He saved our lives. I'm convinced of it. The crew was outstanding, and then we got off the ship to all the rescue people and met an army of loving people to take care of us.
And you didn't mention you were rescued by a helicopter in rough seas.
Yes, we were. We were wrapped up in the gear and lifted with the winch rapidly through a very, very small cable up into the air, into the helicopter where the man grabbed us and said, "Welcome aboard."
You have to pay for that at Disneyland. We had it for free.
But on board, things were thrown around?
Things were incredibly thrown around. It was a very violent storm, and it seemed to increase intensity quickly. It was stormy, and then all of a sudden, in an hour's time, it was just a ferocious storm. Glass was crashing, plants were all over the place, our furniture in our stateroom was throwing us against the wall, but the crew was incredible. They were so well trained. They helped us. Everything was organized. People were calm.
And that was Ruth and David McIntyre, who sound quite exhilarated by that trip. And the ship is now back in the port of Muldy, where damage is being assessed. More than $15 million has so far been donated to 3 large funds to support the families affected by the Christchurch terror attacks. Victim Support, the Christchurch Foundation and New Zealand Muslim Islamic Information Centre have all been inundated with pledges of financial support. The help the families need right now, from food to transport to rent, is being coordinated by Victim Support. Our reporter Joanna Mackenzie has been to the Operations Centre to meet a support worker.
In a quiet corner of Christchurch, a victim support hub has been set up to coordinate the operation to support the families. We've been asked to keep the location secret because the work they're doing is so sensitive. Here I meet Carla Teal, who's caring for a number of families, and that care comes in many different ways.
A lot is food, travel, rental, car rental, counselling, support around their personal family and their needs, flights to support family members that meet our criteria, and some families have repatriated, so we've worked alongside with families and supporting them through with different funeral directors as well.
Carla Teal says while it's challenging work, they're well trained and that training has kicked in. They've also taken advice about how best to support and be respectful of the family's grieving process.
I will ask the family that I'm working for their guidance. I'll be guided by them, so we don't offend, and work within their beliefs and their grieving time to make this process as easy as we can for them.
Support workers were on the ground within hours of the attacks, and Ms Teal says they will be with the families for a long time to come.
We will work with the families, and they will, for as long as they need us. We're guided by them and we hear their needs, and we will work along with them. It doesn't stop here. We do work through, and we have work to do through the judicial process.
Victim Support has already given out $800,000 of the $8.4 million it's so far received in donations. Its chief executive, Kevin So, says they're working closely with other agencies to make sure the right people are getting immediate help.
We have a very close working relationship with the police and other agencies, including health. As we exchange information, access for the victims is very easy. Our referral systems are very, very robust.
To look after the longer-term needs of the families, the Christchurch Foundation has set up a special fund that's already received $4.8 million. Its chief executive, Amy Carter, says the foundation will be led by the community about how the funds will be used.
We need to allow the time and space for the community to learn and express where they feel the greatest needs are. That will evolve over time, so we'll act as guardians of those funds, and then we'll meet with representatives from the Christchurch Muslim community and the families and decide in collaboration with them how those funds will be best used for the future.
Money is still being donated to many different funds that have been set up to support victims. The Department of Internal Affairs is advising people wishing to donate to ask questions about where the money is going and look to give through trusted platforms. In Christchurch for Checkpoint, Joanna Mackenzie.
Hundreds of Muslims from around the country and across the Tasman flew to Christchurch when they heard the news of shootings in the 2 mosques. They visited the wounded in hospital, supported the families of victims and prepared bodies before they were laid to rest last week. And as they mourn the loss of people they've never met, they knew through faith that they would become friends with some of the people they were working with. Some of them told Madison Reedy how friendships have grown from tragedy.
As soon as Mahmoud Hassan found out Muslims were killed as they prayed innocently in 2 mosques, he booked a flight from Brisbane to Christchurch. He left his wife and 4 children in Australia. He didn't know what he'd do when he got here, but he knew he had to help with whatever was needed. Mr Hassan spent the past week preparing bodies to lay to rest at the Memorial Park Cemetery.
We've been selected to be like a part of the volunteer teams. So we wait when the body comes, we carry the body out of the car, put it in the prayer area, and then we guide the family and the crowd straight to the grave.
Mahmoud Hassan says it may seem strange to some that he dropped everything to come to Christchurch in the wake of a tragedy, but he says that's just what Muslims do.
At the end of the day, I believe whoever gets killed, they were my brothers and sisters, so it's my duty to come and show my support.
Ahmed Kalani, the leader of the Australian Support Aid Organisation, says Muslims flew across the Tasman in droves to support those who'd lost loved ones. He says they did so not just because it's the way of Islam, but because it hit home.
With this particular incident where Muslims living in the West, and specifically Australia, because we're so geographically close to New Zealand, we share the same culture, same language. What happened is a lot of people are so, in Australia, even traumatised, thinking this could have happened to us here.
Ahmed Kalani says he's seen so many Australians in Christchurch over the past week, it almost feels like he's back home. It's not just Australians who've dropped everything to come and help. Some Americans did too, as did Muslims in different parts of the country. Mohammed Ashraf Ali found out about the mosque shootings when he was at work in Hamilton. He came to Christchurch as soon as he could. He says while he's been helping at the cemetery, he's made friends for life.
I've met people from all around the world, come from all walks of life, doing all sorts of things, you know, doctors, lawyers, sailors, builders, you know, engineers and whatnot, some of which, you know, like some of the guys that I've met who are from Australia, and we've got close, you know, during these days, and hopefully this is a lifelong relationship that we keep.
Mohammed Ashraf Ali and his newfound friends were reluctant to speak to media because they didn't want the attention. I met them by coincidence over dinner, where they shared laughs in the worst of circumstances. They say they're just here for the families of victims and for the martyrs who were tragically killed. In Christchurch for Checkpoint, Madison Reedy.
And it is 8 minutes away from 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Do send in your feedback. You can text us on 2101, you can tweet us at checkpointrnz or send us an email at checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. A pro-military political party in Thailand has taken an unexpected lead in the country's first election since the army took power 5 years ago. With more than 90% of the votes counted, the Palang Pracha Rath Party has 7.6 million votes, 500,000 more than opposition, the Pheu Thai Party. Now, Pheu Thai is linked to the former Prime Minister, Thaksin Shinawatra, whose loyalists have won every election since 2001. The announcement of official results will be in the next couple of hours. However, it is now looking more likely that the pro-military party will be in a position to form a government under the current leader, Prayut Chan-o-cha, who led the coup as of the Pheu Thai government in 2014. The BBC's Jonathan Head reports.
It was a day that had been promised and then repeatedly postponed. Thais, by and large, participated keenly, despite an electoral system which tilts the odds heavily in the military government's favour. The man who deposed the last elected government in a coup and has run Thailand ever since cast his vote early. General Prayut is bidding to keep his job as Prime Minister. But many younger voters, 7 million of them eligible to vote for the first time, were looking for something different.
Well, I'm happy there's a voting at last. We've been waiting for this election for some time, and I hope it brings good things to the country. We need some younger or newer generations in the government to bring a more modern policy. Less corruption, a more clean government.
That hunger for fresh faces has driven a groundswell of support for a brand new and radical party, Future Forward, under the leadership of a telegenic young businessman. As the polls closed and vote counting began, many Thais crowded round the polling stations, eager to ensure the transparency of the tally. Here, at the headquarters of the largest opposition party, Pheu Thai, cheers greeted every result going their way. Theirs is the party that was ousted by the coup. They were hoping for a comeback. But the results then took a surprising turn. General Prayut's party, which had aroused little enthusiasm during the campaign, went ahead in the popular vote. Future Forward was also polling strongly. But Thailand's oldest and once governing party, the Democrats, had been wiped out in Bangkok. Its leader of 14 years forced to resign. And the Pheu Thai vote, once by far the largest, had fallen sharply. A mystery compounded when the Election Commission inexplicably delayed its announcement of the final result. So what are we to make of these results? Many Thais will want to know how the pro-military party was able to do so unexpectedly well, and why the pro-Thaksin party, winner of all recent elections, performed relatively poorly. But the question that was always going to be asked about this vote was whether it would help Thailand move on from the crippling political conflict of the past 12 years. And even at this early stage, it's difficult to see how this flawed and highly manipulated election can do that.
And that was Jonathan Head in Bangkok. Food supplies have only just reached many government relief centres in Mozambique 10 days after Cyclone Idai ripped through the country. Health authorities say cholera and malaria appear to be unavoidable across wide areas, with the current death toll at over 400 people. Bodies are still being found in trees as the waters recede, and the flooding is so extreme in central regions that the water can be seen in satellite images from outer space. More than 550,000 people have been affected in Mozambique alone, with 110,000 now sheltering in makeshift camps. The ABC's Sarah Dingle reports.
A lone helicopter flies over floodwaters near a river in Mozambique. 10 days after Cyclone Idai, there are still people clinging to high ground, surrounded by floods and in desperate need of assistance. This Indian Navy helicopter is carrying Portuguese Marines and operating under the umbrella of the UN. A Marine descends, asking who needs medical attention, and a single woman is winched into the helicopter. They'll try to return tomorrow. Floodwaters across the country have severely hampered rescue efforts in a country where Cyclone Idai has displaced more than 100,000 people. The Mozambique Minister of Land and Environment, Celso Correa, says the official death toll now stands at 446.
We also have a number of people that were affected, which is 531,000. Obviously, these are preliminary numbers. As soon as we do our survey of the ground, we'll be able to give you updates on this. Just to say that the people that are safe in our camps are almost 110,000 people already in the camps.
With the floodwaters very slow to drain, he says the spread of disease is inevitable.
We'll have cholera for sure. I was explaining in Portuguese that we'll have cholera, we'll have malaria. It's unavoidable in this situation. So the government is opening a cholera treatment centre already.
Cyclone Idai first made landfall at the port city of Beira and then swept inland. Locals scrambled to higher ground, but for many, aid didn't arrive. In John Sagrado village, northwest of Beira, resident Juliana Costa says the disaster took everyone by surprise.
People here died on the trees because there was no support. Even today, there were dead bodies in the trees because there's no support.
The local bridge has swept away, making it near impossible for aid to get through without a helicopter. Juliana Costa says time is running out.
All the food is gone and we don't have anything in the storehouse. We have no clothes, no pans, because the water from the river came into our house, along with the wind.
In other areas, as floodwaters recede, more bodies are being discovered in Mozambique, with casualties also mounting in neighbouring Zimbabwe and Malawi. Aid workers say the final death toll in Mozambique alone could be more than the president's estimate of 1,000 a few days after the cyclone hit.
And time now for some of your feedback. This from Maureen in Auckland. She says, I hope the millions of dollars donated to victim support will be used immediately for psychological assistance to the victims. Can you check this for all of us who have donated, please? And this one about the cows. This is a story that we played earlier. Ben was on a ferry from Picton to Wellington and saw cows being transported that he said were incredibly emaciated. He took pictures of those cows. I'm not blindly pro-dairy, says this person, but this guy Ben is indulging in a lot of speculation for the sake of some tabloid media-style outrage instead of informing the authorities first. In fact, MPI is investigating that particular case. And this one from Ray Lilly. Hi, Ray. He says, for the 100 murdered and wounded Muslims in Christchurch, the figure of 15 million sounds impressive, but it's only 150,000 per victim.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leia tawa tēnei. The Prime Minister says the Royal Commission into the Christchurch mosque attacks will be asked to thoroughly investigate the shootings, but also to deliver its finding in a timely manner. The terms of reference and the person to head the inquiry will be confirmed in the next fortnight. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
The inquiry will look at the events leading up to the terrorist attack and whether law enforcement and intelligence agencies could have done anything to prevent the massacre. Jacinda Ardern also wants it to look at how such events could be prevented in the future. She also announced a whistle-stop visit to China, where she'll meet President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang in Beijing. A much longer visit had originally been planned, but that's been pared right back in the wake of the shootings. She says in the circumstances it did not feel appropriate, and the Chinese authorities have been very accommodating. From Parliament, Jane Patterson.
The Foreign Minister is insisting the Turkish President has utterly changed his message about Christchurch despite him still broadcasting video of the shootings after Winston Peters' visit. Recep Tayyip Erdogan initially lashed out at the Anzacs after the massacre and repeatedly played footage at his political rallies, even though New Zealand asked that it not be shared. Mr Peters flew to Turkey on Friday to address a meeting of Islamic leaders, and he says Mr Erdogan's narrative has dramatically changed.
He's not showing the same length of video. There are blurred parts of it now where New Zealand has been taken out. You can't deny that it mentions the fact it was Christchurch, but thereafter his personal rhetoric around the video has utterly changed. There's no mention of New Zealand anymore.
Winston Peters says the Islamic countries in attendance had universal praise for New Zealand's response. He also rejected media reports that he had been napping during the meeting, saying he was in a state of deep contemplation and had comprehensive notes. A new case of meningococcal W disease has been diagnosed in Northland. The patient, a baby girl from Hokianga, is too young to have been vaccinated. The District Health Board says the 7-month-old is recovering after she and her whānau were treated with antibiotics. But it's the first case in the region since an outbreak of the deadly new strain was declared last spring. And the DHB says it shows the deadly new strain is still circulating in the north. About 63% of children eligible for free shots in Northland have been vaccinated over summer. But the DHB says in Hokianga, only 50% of those eligible have been vaccinated, and that's not enough to keep others safe. It says if Northland doesn't increase those percentages, it's at risk of another outbreak. Cantabrians suspected of having measles are being asked to stay away from large gatherings as the number of confirmed cases rises to 34. Canterbury District Health Board's Chief Medical Officer Raymond Pink says GPs are still under pressure to vaccinate the immediate priority group, which is those aged between 12 months and 13 years who have never been immunised against the disease. He says there is a risk that measles and also flu cases could spread as people gather to mourn the lives lost in the Christchurch terror attacks. Dr Pink says he understands this is difficult because people do want to gather together at this time. Donald Trump has tweeted that he's been totally exonerated after the conclusions of the long-awaited Mueller report were released. According to a summary of Robert Mueller's report, he's found no evidence that the US president or his top campaign aides colluded with the Russians during the 2016 presidential election. Our Washington correspondent Simon Marks has more.
The White House is celebrating the findings of the Mueller report, principal among them that there was no collusion between the Trump campaign in 2016 and Russia. But the president is not feeling charitable towards the special prosecutor.
This was an illegal
takedown that failed.
He claimed the report offers him complete exoneration. In fact, it specifically says the special prosecutor cannot exonerate President Trump over obstruction of justice allegations.
Simon Marks. The Democrats are calling for the release of the full report. Israeli police and medics say a house caught on fire and 6 people were wounded after a suspected rocket attack from the Gaza Strip. The early morning attack in Mishmeret, north of Tel Aviv, comes at a time of high tension ahead of the anniversary of Gaza border protests and an election campaign in Israel. Heavy rain is falling in the west of the South Island, with warnings of up to half a metre forecast along the main divide. Parts of State Highway 6 near Haast have already been flooded. Met Service is forecasting extremely heavy rainfall of between 500 and 700 millimetres for Westland, south of Ortida, through to tomorrow night. Similarly, heavy rain is also forecast for Fiordland and the headwaters of lakes and rivers in Otago, Southland and Canterbury. NIWA meteorologist Ben Knowles says after a largely settled summer, severe weather is on the way.
This is all very hazardous weather, so if you are in the region, it's certainly time to respect the weather, as it will go downhill if it hasn't already across the South Island. Again, that will intensify and peak during the day and night on Tuesday.
It's 6:05. There's a lot on the line for reigning ANZ Premiership champions, the Southern Steel, when they face the Central Pulse in a grand final rematch in Wellington tonight. Netball reporter Ravinda Hunia has more.
The 2 top teams of the competition will play each other for the first time since last year's grand final in a match to determine who will top the leaderboard. The Steel currently lead with 13 points, but a win for the Pulse, who are on 12 points, will see them overtake the reigning champions and continue their undefeated run after 5 games. The Southerners were beaten by the Northern Stars in the first round, but have rediscovered their form of last year and topped the standings, having played an extra game. The Pulse have impressed at both ends of the court so far this season, but the Southerners may have the advantage in the shooting circle, with connections with South African shooter Lenise Potgieter finally coming to fruition. The Pulse have never lost a premiership match at tonight's venue at TSB Arena. Centre pass is at 7:40. Ko Ravinda Hunia tēnei.
The New Zealand golfer Lydia Ko has come up short of her first win of the LPGA Tour season. Ko has finished tied for 8th at the Founders Cup in Phoenix. The former world number 1 has tied for 3rd, or was tied for 3rd early in her final round before finishing 4 shots off the pace. And the attendance record for women's football in Italy has been smashed by almost 3 times the previous best. 39,000 people watched Juventus beat Fiorentina 1-0 in Turin this morning. The crowd was 25,000 more than the previous record set in 2008, and comes a week after a record crowd of more than 60,000 watched a match between Spanish women's club teams Barcelona and Atletico Madrid. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Dana Johansson looks back on the weekend's sport. There's a window on the world of last year's wildfires in California. Was it really the fault of the trees, as Donald Trump tweeted? And bringing the power to the people with Mark Ryle, part of the team that maintains this country's network of high-tension transmission lines. On Nights with me, Brian Crump, from after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. A significant heavy rainfall event is expected for western parts of the South Island. But starting with Northland through to Taranaki and Taupo, including Bay of Plenty, fine spells and isolated showers. Whanganui, Taihape and Manawatu, also Gisborne, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa, mostly fine weather. Horowhenua, Kapiti, Wellington, Marlborough and Nelson, mainly fine today, occasional showers tomorrow, but only a few in Marlborough. For Bulla, mostly cloudy with a few showers, rain with heavy falls developing later tomorrow. Westland and Fiordland, heavy rain with downpours about the ranges and possible thunderstorms. Christchurch and Canterbury Plains, high cloud, scattered rain developing tomorrow. Canterbury High Country, Otago and Southland, occasional rain becoming persistent tomorrow with heavy falls near the main divide. Severe gale nor'westerlies developing for the High Country tomorrow morning. At the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. It's coming up to 9 minutes past 6. You're with RNZ National.
Thanks, Susanna. And this is Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. The Prime Minister says holding a royal commission into the Christchurch terrorist attack reflects the gravity of the event and the serious questions left in its wake. The terms of reference and the person to head the inquiry will be confirmed in the next fortnight. Jacinda Ardern has also announced a very short trip to China that has been pared back significantly as a result of the mass shooting. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
The Commission's terms of reference have not yet been set, but Jacinda Ardern says they will reflect the seriousness of the attack and the need to get answers as quickly as possible. She says it will look at whether the police and intelligence agencies could have done anything to prevent it.
While New Zealanders and Muslim communities around the world are both grieving and showing compassion for one another, they are also quite rightly asking questions on how this terror attack was able to happen here. This includes questions around the accessibility of semi-automatic weapons, the role social media has played generally, and the focus of the intelligence and security services.
A Royal Commission is the highest level inquiry that can be held. It reports to the Governor-General, so is completely independent of the government. It also has powers of compulsion in relation to witnesses, obtaining documentation and awarding costs. Ms Ardern says the inquiry will primarily look at the events leading up to the shooting.
In short, the inquiry will look at what could have or should have been done to prevent the attack. It will inquire into the individual and his activities before the terrorist attack, including, of course, a look at agencies. It will look at the actions of the SIS, the GCSB, police, customs, immigration, and any other relevant government departments or agencies.
She also announced a very short trip to China early next week, that too affected by the mass shooting. Over recent weeks, there had been speculation about the state of the relationship with Beijing, with tensions over Huawei and the postponement of a major tourism event. Ms Ardern says a much longer visit had initially been planned.
But given the terrorist attacks in Christchurch, I've cut it back to 1 day of meetings. This is an important visit. New Zealand places a high priority on our relationship with China. Our businesses value the relationships they have, and I do look forward to our ongoing engagement.
The Foreign Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Winston Peters was also at the media briefing this afternoon, fresh from a flying visit to Indonesia and then Turkey. The Turkish President Erdogan caused consternation by playing blurred parts of the video of the attack at public rallies. He also made comments about sending people home in caskets if they came to Turkey and expressed anti-Muslim sentiment. Mr Peters explains what his priority was for the visit.
My focus was to ensure the safety of New Zealanders travelling in Turkey in the future, and particularly with Anzac Day coming up. So, in that sense, I'm delighted with the response and the assurance he gave me personally.
Mr Peters was asked whether reports he was napping at a meeting attended by dozens of Muslim leaders in Turkey were correct. He said he was in a state of deep contemplation, was paying close attention, and there were comprehensive notes from the meeting. Mr Peters now travels to Malaysia, which he says gives him the opportunity to thank that country for its friendship and support and to express New Zealand's sorrow for its loss. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Jane Patterson.
The Privacy Commissioner says Facebook hasn't accepted any accountability for its part in the Christchurch terror attack. John Edwards sent a letter to Facebook executives last week stating there is growing frustration and anger over the company's lack of communication after the attack was live streamed on the social network. Mr Edwards told RNZ reporter Ben Strang that he did receive some correspondence from Facebook last week, but it didn't have anything to do with the mosque attacks.
I received an email from Facebook on Thursday night notifying me of a privacy breach. This is the storage of the passwords in plain text. No mention in that of the incidents of the previous week, in which Facebook played a central role. What we haven't seen, and what is a real disappointment to me, is any kind of acceptance of Facebook's role, any sort of critical self-reflection, any contrition or response. I mean, here we are 10 days after, and you can still live stream presumably the same event. Is that service safe? Is it still offered? Why wasn't it pulled? You know, these are some of the questions that you'd expect them to engage with.
So what is needed in regards to New Zealand law for us to be able to take action against a company like Facebook?
Well, that, I think, is part of a wider conversation that government will be looking at the moment. There's a whole range of laws that are engaged here. There's a legislative model which treats those kinds of platforms as if they are just neutral deliverers of messages. And I think, as the Prime Minister said, those assumptions are highly questionable in these days of curated, algorithmically delivered news feeds based on preferences and, the desire to capture the attention of the user by feeding them more and more of the things which they've expressed an interest in.
What do you think needs to happen? Because as things stand, a gigantic company like Facebook has zero accountability, it seems.
I think accountability is really the key word here. Platforms have to be more accountable for the content and conduct they facilitate than they've been willing to accept so far. And that, I think, is a change that is being demanded across the world. We've seen parliamentary reports out of the UK in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. We've seen calls to account in a number of parts of the world. So I do think that that time has now come, and that it's important for a number of sort of liberal democracies to really confront this question.
And that was the Privacy Commissioner John Edwards talking to RNZ reporter Ben Strang. It's been Washington's elephant in the room for almost 2 years. The long-awaited conclusions of the Mueller probe have been summarised and released by the US Attorney General William Barr in a 4-page letter to Congress today. It says there's no evidence that Donald Trump or his top campaign aides colluded with the Russians during the 2016 presidential election. But it does say that while the president did not commit a crime, it can't exonerate him. Elizabeth Brown reports.
Donald Trump has repeatedly called the investigation a hoax and a witch hunt. As he boarded Air Force One, he told reporters he's now feeling vindicated.
There was no collusion with Russia, the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. There was no collusion with Russia. There was no obstruction, and none whatsoever. And it was a complete and total exoneration. This was an illegal takedown that failed. And hopefully somebody's going to be looking at the other side. So it's complete exoneration, no collusion, no obstruction. Thank you very much.
Rudy Giuliani is part of Mr. Trump's legal team. He says it's a huge victory.
We've had a chance to quickly go through it. We think it's a complete exoneration of the president. Certainly, it's quite clear no collusion of any kind, including the entire Trump campaign, which kind of raises the question, why did this ever start in the first place?
But while criminally Mr. Trump may be in the clear, the Democrats who've been looking to the report as a potential tool for impeachment are demanding it be released in full. The Democratic chair of the powerful House Judicial Committee, Jerrold Nadler, says the Attorney General William Barr is not a neutral party, and his summary was put together in less than 48 hours.
His conclusions raise more questions than they answer, given the fact that Mueller uncovered evidence that, in his own words, does not exonerate the president. It is unconscionable that President Trump would try to spin the special counsel's findings as if his conduct was remotely acceptable. Given these questions, it is imperative that the Attorney General release the full report and the underlying evidence.
And another Democratic congressman, Chris Combs, says he doesn't believe the Mueller report does clear Donald Trump.
It strongly suggests that at the most senior levels, folks in the Trump campaign had a whole series of inappropriate contacts with Russians and then lied about it. If there was nothing for them to hide, why did they do so much lying and misrepresenting? And why do that to the extent that you've now got a half dozen senior people with convictions confessions or guilty pleas.
Meanwhile, Elizabeth Wider, who's the president of the Constitutional Accountability Centre in Washington, believes the Democrats will have to battle to get the full report released.
I think that's going to be a major fight. Look, this is something that the American people have been following very closely for the last 2 years almost. It's something that is gravely important to the health and future of our democracy. We have no question here that the Russians did interfere in the 2016 election. And the question is whether or not the President of the United States had any cooperation in that, encouraged that, etc. And so when you have such a weighty issue that was investigated so thoroughly, you want to see what evidence is out there. I think a lot of folks who were critics of Trump in particular expected the Mueller report to kind of swoop in and save them from this administration. But the Constitution lays out clearly what you do when you have a corrupt president, and it doesn't lay that responsibility at the feet of a special counsel. It lays it at the feet of the people at the ballot box, or if it comes to that, at the feet of Congress to decide on whether or not to impeach the president.
And the Department of Justice has announced that the Mueller investigation is now complete and there will be no more charges laid.
Elizabeth Brown with that report. Time's up, Theresa. That's the headline on the front page of The Sun in the UK as the Brits get ready to face another working week. Theresa May's prospects of getting her Brexit deal through Parliament this week have dropped dramatically after a tense summit with Boris Johnson and other leaders broke up without agreement over the weekend. The talks took place amid reports of an imminent coup to remove Mrs May, claims which have so far been strongly denied by senior Conservatives. The BBC's Nick Eardley reports.
Theresa May has perhaps days to save her Brexit plan and potentially her leadership. Some Conservatives are openly calling for the Prime Minister to resign. Senior backbenchers have told her there is more chance her deal will pass if she announces her departure, though it's far from certain even that dramatic move would prove successful. Two of those who had been suggested as caretaker short-term Prime Ministers have distanced themselves from the prospect, though. Mrs May's de facto deputy, the Cabinet Office Minister David Lidington, said he had no desire to be PM and he was 100% behind Mrs May. The Environment Secretary, Michael Gove, called for cool heads.
We need to make sure that colleagues in the Cabinet and across the country recognise that in the course of this week we have very important decisions to make, and I hope as many people as possible will recognise that the best way of honouring the referendum mandate and making sure that we leave in an orderly fashion is to support the Prime Minister in her efforts.
In this volatile political climate, what will happen in the coming days is far from clear. The Chancellor, Philip Hammond, hit out at the idea of a coup.
To be talking about changing the players on the board, frankly, is self-indulgent at this time. We have to decide how we want to proceed.
But publicly and privately, there are questions over Mrs May's future. The former Minister, George Freeman, said there was a national crisis and a caretaker PM was needed. The former Tory leader and Brexit supporter, Ian Duncan Smith, said those calling for Mrs May to go now should shut up, but was more lukewarm on her medium-term future.
This now breaks into a second phase, so that would be assuming that the withdrawal agreement got through. If it did get through, then I think the second phase needs to be tackled separately and differently.
By somebody else?
Well, that is a possibility, but I say that this is not something I am now saying I recommend right here and now.
It is not clear whether the Prime Minister will put her deal to MPs again in the coming days, with Cabinet Ministers fearful of a third defeat. But it seems MPs will now have a chance to vote on alternative strategies to the government's. This afternoon, the Prime Minister met senior ministers and Brexit-supporting backbenchers at her country retreat in Chequers. She will continue to try to persuade Conservative MPs to back her plan. The next few days could be make or break for the deal that took 2 years to reach, but also for Mrs May.
And that was Nick Eardley reporting. Heavy rain is battering the west of the South Island with forecast warnings of up to half a metre of rain along parts of the main divide. A strong wind warning is also in place for many places on both the North and South Islands. And Met Service and other agencies are warning people to take precautions. Chen Liu has more.
Met Service says severe weather is coming to the South Island with unprecedented rain in Westerland, Fiordland, as well as the headwaters of lakes and rivers in Canterbury and Otago. Met Service forecaster William Nepe says the rain will be unprecedented, even in typical wet areas of the South Island's west coast.
We've already had several stations in Fiordland record over 100 mils in about 12 to 15 hours. To put it into context, our warning criteria is 100 mils over 24 hours. So we've got stations that have already had it between 100 and 200 and 12 to 15 hours, and we're expecting more.
Mr. Nepe says the rain may cause streams and rivers to rise rapidly and lead to significant flooding and slips. Tourists, hikers and motorists should take extra care. Met Service also issued strong wind watches for places including Marlborough, Wellington, Wairarapa, Canterbury Plains and Otago. NIWA's Ben Noel says the summer was a tale of two seasons, starting with unsettled in December and ending with warmer and drier weather. He says the worst of it is still to come.
This is all very hazardous weather, so if you are in the region, it's certainly time to respect the weather, as it will go downhill if it hasn't already across the South Island. Again, that will intensify and peak during the day and night on Tuesday.
Mr. Noor says some rain will spill over to the east of the South Island, including Dunedin and Christchurch, but it won't be as intense. Lawrence Voigt from Via an Emergency in East Otago says his area has been incredibly dry and would appreciate some rain.
There is some rain coming, but also I think later in the week it's to be accompanied by high winds. So that of course puts up other challenges in the area relating to damage to trees and the environment that our people may have to respond to.
Mark Rivel-Johnson from the AA says people should pay extra attention while driving in poor weather conditions.
One of the main things to do in wet weather is to increase your following distance. The road code recommends a 4-second following distance in wet weather, but essentially you should always be able to stop in the distance you can see to be clear. If your view has been obscured by spray from other vehicles, then drop back from them.
Mr. Rivel-Johnson adds that people should make sure their car wipers and headlights are working well and keep their windscreen and windows clean. For Checkpoint, Kuo Chen-Liu, Aho.
Now, on paper, he is a maths and physics teacher from a remote village in Kenya's Rift Valley. But Peter Tabichi has won a prestigious international prize for his work in the classroom, worth more than $1 million. He was chosen from over 10,000 nominees from around the world by an education charity based in the United Arab Emirates. The BBC's Matt Pickles was at the ceremony in the United Arab Emirates.
The winner of the Global Teacher Prize for 2019 is Peter Tabichi.
That's Hugh Jackman, the actor and former teaching assistant, announcing this year's Global Teacher Prize at a ceremony in Dubai on Sunday. The winner, Peter Tabichi, teaches science at Keriko Secondary School in a poor and remote part of Kenya's Rift Valley. Mr. Tabichi started a school science club, which has won national and international science awards. He gives 80% of his salary to the local community and will also donate this $1 million prize.
How does it feel to be the world's best teacher?
It feels great. It's a great honor to me. I'm very excited. Yes.
And what will you do with your prize?
This one I'm going to give it back to the society and ensure that the challenges which they are facing, like where I work, are addressed.
The prize is part of the annual Global Education and Skills Forum in Dubai, which was started by the Vaki Foundation. Former British Prime Minister Tony Blair was among the speakers at the forum. He said the prize is a boost for the teaching profession.
It creates so much hope, I think, amongst those who are in the teaching profession, often doing very difficult jobs, when they see that those from their profession who are doing great things are recognised as great people.
As for Mr. Tabichi, he's looking forward to celebrating with his students when he returns to school in Kenya.
And 2 concerts have been announced to raise funds for those affected by the Christchurch terror attacks, with more than a dozen top New Zealand acts already signed up to play. Anika Moore, Dave Dobbin, Bikrunga, Fat Freddy's Drop, Marlon Williams, Shapeshifter, 660 Teeks and Stan Walker are among those who will take to the stage for the fundraiser. The first event will happen on Saturday, April the 13th at Spark Arena in Auckland, with a second concert in Christchurch on Wednesday the 17th at Christchurch Stadium. Now, tickets for those 2 gigs, they go on sale on Thursday. Just enough time for a little bit of your feedback before we go. This is regarding Ben's story. This is the guy on the ferry coming across Cook Strait who took pictures of cattle who he says were emaciated and being transported on trucks. Nita says, re Ben's story some 25 years ago was travelling back from the Marlborough Sounds through the Rye Valley, where I stopped by an ice cream, sweltering day. A few minutes later, we see a double trailer packed so tight with sheep sitting in the full sun. I felt so much empathy for those poor animals. She says she threw her ice cream out of the window that day and has been a veggie ever since, she says. Now, if you're in the South Island, be warned, there is some severe weather coming your way, mainly on the west coast. You can go to the Met Service and have a look at the specific areas for you, but they are advising an exceptional amount of rain is forecast over Monday and Tuesday, which could lead to significant flooding and slips with possible road closures. So keep an eye out. Westlands south of Otera and also Canterbury Lakes and rivers south of Arthur's Pass. All the details are on the Met Service website, but that's it for Checks Point this evening. So do appreciate you joining us. If you tuned in on radio, television, online, however you chose to connect with us today, you can catch up on all our stories. They'll be online or on our Facebook page. And for the latest news, information and feature stories from all around New Zealand and the world, go to the RNZ homepage, rnz.co.nz. But from me, Lisa Owen, and the rest of the Checkpoint team, you have a great evening.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Good evening. The terms of reference for a royal commission into the Christchurch mosque attacks will be confirmed in the next 2 weeks. The Ministry for Primary Industries is investigating the treatment of emaciated cattle transported across Cook Strait yesterday. A baby girl in Northland is recovering after being treated for infection with the new W strain of meningococcal disease. And Dave Dobbins, 660, Shapeshifter and Fat Freddy's Drop are among artists to perform at fundraising concerts for victims of the Christchurch terror attacks next month. Those are the headlines. Our next news is at 7.
RNZ National, with a fresh take on the day's news at 10 every weeknight with Karen Hay.
Thousands of New Zealanders converged on Hagley Park in Christchurch this afternoon to show unity to the Muslim community,
including the latest national and international news from the RNZ News team.
Islam does not permit harm to the people or to